President Trump is looking to take on tax reform, and he recently revealed his tax reform plan. And even though his entire plan fits on one page, this reform is still sweeping. Now, this is what Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin had to say about it.
This is going to be the biggest tax cut and the largest tax reform in the history of our country, and we are committed to seeing this through.
So I do think he's right. This really is a huge reform plan. But I think that, we probably shouldn't characterize it as tax reform so much as it's just a gift to the rich. That's basically what this is. This is one of the largest giveaways to the American elites ever. The current 7 tax brackets will be streamlined to 3, 10%, 25%, and 35%. The top rate will drop to 35 from 39.6%, but the Trump administration has not said which income ranges would apply to those brackets. Tax Policy Center has estimated the top 1% of households would see a 14% increase in after-tax income, while low and middle-class Americans would see gains of just 1.2 to 1.8%. The standard deduction, currently $6,350 for single people and $12,700 for married couples, would double. As a result, many more low to moderate income families would pay no taxes, but all other deductions, except for mortgage interest and charitable contributions, would be eliminated, including state and local taxes and medical expenses. About 70% of Americans, mostly low to moderate income, currently take the standard deduction and would benefit. The estate, or so-called death tax, would be scrapped. The 40% tax currently applies to a $5.5 million inheritance for individuals and $11 million for married couples. The alternative minimum tax, which generally hits households with incomes of at least several $100,000, would be ditched. The current rate is 28% for income that qualifies, and it hits individuals who otherwise would benefit from a sharply lower effective rate because of deductions. A 3.8% tax on the interest, dividends, and capital gains of higher income households that helps fund the Affordable Care Act would vanish. Now, the New York Times adds that the proposal envisions slashing the tax rate paid by businesses, large and small, to 15%. Corporations would not have to pay taxes on their foreign profits, an unusual proposal for a president who has championed an America First approach and railed against companies that move jobs and resources overseas. They would also enjoy a special one-time opportunity to bring home cash that they are parking overseas, though administration officials would not say how low that rate would be or how they would ensure that the money would be invested productively. So what Donald Trump is doing here is he is cutting his own taxes. I mean, the things that he's proposing here, the alternative minimum, the so-called death tax, which is just the estate tax, these are things that benefit him and his family. So the death tax is what Republicans call a tax on rich people when they die. That wealth gets carried over to their inheritance, their children. And we tax that at a higher rate. But Donald Trump is making sure that when he dies, his children will be able to get most of his inheritance without high taxes on it. So he's basically doing this to help himself, to help his family, to help his rich friends and family, and I find it shameless. I mean, this is just a shameless bill. This is a complete giveaway to the wealthiest Americans. It's a giveaway to himself. So he was elected, gets in office, and one of the first things he tries to do is cut his own taxes within the first 100 days. It's absolutely ridiculous. Now, the problem with these tax cuts, and with them being so large, is that even though some of these changes will increase federal revenue, overall, this will underfund the federal government. Now, according to Tax Policy Center, this will raise the federal debt to $7.2 trillion in the first decade and $20.9 trillion by 2036. And that's trillion with a T. We're not talking billions. We're not talking millions. He is so hell-bent on cutting his own taxes and the taxes of his rich friends that he is willing to raise the debt by $20.9 trillion. So I'm going to ask the question, because whenever I talk about Medicare for All, whenever progressives bring up tuition-free colleges and universities, they ask us the same question. So how the hell is Donald Trump going to pay for it? Well, according to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, it's going to pay for itself.
Will it pay for itself? Again, I think, as we've said, we're working on lots of details as to this. We have over 100 people in the Treasury that have been working on tax and scoring lots of different scenarios. This will pay for itself with growth.
Why the fuck you lying?
So everything he's saying there is completely unrealistic. How do you expect to cut taxes for the rich this much and not create debt? I mean, you can't. It's impossible with the extent to which he's cutting taxes for the wealthy. There's no way you can get around it. And think about this. I mean, he's cutting the corporate tax rate from 35 to 15%. Now, this does actually benefit some small businesses as well, some small businesses, but even though our tax rate is 35%, that's the marginal rate. You don't effectively pay that much after you take into account loopholes and deductions. Corporations do not pay 35%. They are able to get away with not paying taxes a lot of the time. I mean, there are some corporations that pay zero. We pay more in taxes than some corporations. How crazy is that? Now, you know what he's doing here is he's trying to be somewhat generous. He's trying to throw us peasants some crumbs. And he's saying, well, what I'm doing is doubling the standard deduction. And, you know, this would be a good thing for most Americans. You'd get a slight uptick, although he's eliminating the other deductions. So even though he's giving us a little tiny boost, he's giving himself and his rich friends a gigantic boost. And furthermore, when it comes to the middle class, who's already being squeezed, Steve Mnuchin cannot say unequivocally that this tax reform plan would not hurt the middle class. Take his word for it.
Can you tell a middle-class family watching right now, family of four, earning $60,000, how much they'll save under the president's plan?
Well, first of all, let me say it's great to be here with you this morning, and this is about middle-income tax cuts. And although we're not releasing the specific numbers, this is about creating economic effects and tax cuts for the middle class. It's also about creating tax simplification so that most Americans will be able to fill out their tax returns on a giant postcard. People are tired of way too much complexity, and this is also about making business taxes competitive, which will create American jobs.
But don't the details matter? Why can't you say how this is going to affect a middle-class family?
Well, the issue is that we are working with the House and the Senate, and our objective is to turn this into a bill that will pass and the president will sign. And as you know, the details of taxes are very complicated, and we're committed to working quickly and getting this done. This is about telling the American public what the president's principles are, which are all about economic growth, jobs, jobs, jobs.
Can you guarantee that no one in the middle class is going to pay more?
That's our objective, absolutely.
Is it a guarantee?
I can't make any guarantees until this thing is done and on the president's desk, but I can tell you that's our #1 objective in this.
So if he's not willing to unequivocally say that this will not increase taxes on the middle class, then you can bet your ass that as a way of paying for those tax cuts to rich people, this will hurt the middle class. And even though he's giving poor people something by doubling the standard deduction, this is really a catch-22 if you think about it, because what he's trying to do is sell it to poor people by increasing the standard deduction. But again, this is a trade-off because he's eliminating other deductions. But I mean, the bulk of this bill is tax cuts to the wealthy, and he doesn't have a plan on how to pay for the tax cuts to the rich. Now, what's going to happen is he's going to give poor Americans a tiny break, a little teeny tiny break by doubling the standard deduction, and that's a good thing. But those same people who will benefit from the standard deduction will inevitably be screwed over by the same tax plan, because when you cut taxes for the wealthy so much that you underfund the government, well, they're going to have to dip into programs that disproportionately benefit the poor people who would in fact receive this standard deduction. So obviously we're going to be cutting social safety net programs, welfare assistance. So even though you may get this standard deduction and you might like this bill, even though it's a giveaway to the rich, well, you're going to get screwed over because overall there's just going to be less government assistance, because you can't cut taxes this much and not find a way to pay for it. And the way that you pay for it is by taking that burden, the tax burden of the wealthy, and shifting it onto the middle class, cutting programs for the poor. So again, if you're in favor of this deduction, the standard deduction doubling, I feel you. But this is a huge trade-off, and don't just take what he's giving you, because this is a catch-22. He's screwing you over. And also, when it comes to the standard deduction, the New York Times explains, Mr. Trump wants to double the standard deduction for individuals, essentially eliminating taxes on around $24,000 of a couple's earnings. That proposal was met with alarm by home builders and real estate agents who fear it would disincentivize the purchase of homes. The proposal would scrap most itemized deductions, such as those for state and local tax payments, a valuable break for taxpayers in Democratic states like California and New York. So, I think that there's a lot of people who may initially who voted for Trump specifically, who knee-jerk reaction, they're going to see this as a good thing, but unfortunately, there's a huge trade-off. This will hurt certain people more. This is going to hurt the poor people who will get this standard deduction, because again, you don't cut taxes this much for the wealthy without finding out a way to finance it, and you put that burden on the backs of poor people. It's called trickle-down economics. Reagan did it, and now Trump is doing the same thing. Bush did the same thing. I mean, we've seen this over and over again. So this is history repeating itself. Donald Trump is giving the poor some crumbs while him and his rich friends are taking the whole buffet. So this overall plan, if you can even call it a plan, it's just a complete disaster. It's a complete disaster. And you can bet your ass that Republicans will not come on board unless Donald Trump, well, some Republicans anyways, won't come on board unless Donald Trump explicitly outlines a way to pay for these tax cuts for the rich. And stay vigilant, because you know where it's going to come from. It's going to come from you. It's going to hurt you, the poorest working class Americans. So this is something that cannot stand. So, it's really shameless to me. We have a billionaire elected. He's an oligarch, and he's cutting his own taxes. If you're not insulted by this, if you're not insulted by how he betrayed you if you voted for him, then you're not paying attention.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.